on this glorious evening to the 50th, I believe, talk in the University of Buckingham Great Lives, Great Minds Fireside series of talks, where we have an enormous range of topics, from science to philosophy to religion, to literature, to history, to geography, that we cover, deliberately trying to be as broad as possible. Linda Porter tonight is going to be talking about her book Mistresses, and we are delighted to have you. Linda, how are you?
I'm very well, thank you, Anthony.
And can I say a particular welcome, as always, to those who are new to the series. And you are very, very welcome, not just to tonight's talk, obviously, but to all those that have happened in the past and all those that will happen in the future. Do join and do let others know about this talk tonight and the others. So, Linda, what I do very cheekily and nosily is to ask our guest of the evening just to briefly describe the room that they're in, simply because it's interesting to talk to writers about the home that they're in, because we couldn't do that if we were at a book or a history or a literary festival. So where are you?
I'm in my study, which is in the back of my house in Sevenoaks in Kent, and it looks out over our sizable back garden, which has got a huge ash tree in it, and the evening sun is now shining on it, and it looks very nice.
And is this where you do your writing?
Yes, it is, Anthony. Yes, it is where I write.
And do you have, are you a morning writer, or do you go throughout the day? How do you, when you have the pressure of a deadline on you, how do you set about the task?
I am normally a morning writer. I think that goes back actually to part of my interesting previous life. I worked for nearly a quarter of a century in the corporate world. And like many people in those days, I was accustomed to a kind of, well, 9 to 6 probably day, but I am accustomed to starting after breakfast, as it were. And I'm blessed with being able to write quite quickly. And if I've done 4 hours, then I will have done it quite intensively, and that is long enough for me per day.
It's tiring, isn't it?
It is, yes.
But it's not half as tiring as having a bad writing day, whereas having a good writing day can be very energizing. Anyway, well, we can now picture you where you write these marvelous books covering the Tudors and Stuarts, and Mary and Catherine Parr, and we can see you, imagine you writing there. And now, what are you going to tell us about tonight?
Well, I'm going to talk about my latest book, Mistresses, Sex and Scandal at the Court of Charles II, which came out in middle of April at the height of lockdown. And I'm pleased to say that it attracted quite a lot of critical notice and interest. And so I have done a number of podcasts about it, but this is the first virtual talk. So I'm very happy to be here to tell you a bit about Charles II and some of his ladies.
Well, we're very excited to be the first live talk that you've given on this, and thank you for choosing us.
Oh, thank you very much for asking me. So if I may, I will begin with Charles II himself. I will, at the end of this talk, perhaps give a slight overall analysis of the king and his reign, although this talk is really about some of the women in his life who are every bit as interesting as he is. But what I would say to begin with, I think, is that people who work on Charles II and his reign, as I did, are sometimes surprised by the continuing view of him, which, if there is such a thing, is in like our popular historical mind as British people, I think, because we do view him as the merry monarch, and he's someone who has acquired this kind of status in general view as being rather a jolly good type, you know, a breath of fresh air after what is perceived, I have to say quite wrongly, to be the stultification of the period of the English Republic under Cromwell. And we're inclined to think that his peccadillos are all really rather fun. If at all possible, I think many men would like to have been like him. His court is viewed as rollicking and a bit naughty, but we sort of forgive him for this. And he's also viewed, I think, as being very popular. Now, underlying this, there is a rather harsher and less pleasant reality. And if you consider the origin of the phrase, the merry monarch, it actually comes in one of the typically pithy epithets of that great roue and rake, the Earl of Rochester. And the lines go as follow: restless he rolls from whore to whore, a merry monarch, scandalous and poor. And caught up in those two lines are quite a variety of interesting ideas, which perhaps give you some glimpse of what the real man might actually have been like. And it's the whores I'm going to talk about tonight. I will now refer to them as ladies, since it's not a very polite term. But in the general area of description of women and of Charles and the women who were his mistresses, it wasn't a very polite and nice time. But what I'm going to do to begin with is take you back to the Christmas of 1648. And here is Charles II as a young man. He was still Prince of Wales then, resplendent in all his armour, in which he wouldn't at that stage really have fought very much. And in the Christmas of 1648, Charles was at The Hague at the court of his brother-in-law, William II of Orange, and Charles's sister, the sibling nearest to him in age, Princess Mary Stuart. And it was rather a dismal time, partly because the royal couple there, the Stadtholder William and his wife Mary, really didn't have a very happy marriage. Mary had been married at the tender age of 9 and removed shortly afterwards to the Netherlands by her mother, and had grown up there an extremely unhappy and peeved young woman. But she and her brother were very close. And when he escaped from England in 1646, he went first to Jersey, to the Channel Isles, thence to Paris, to the court of his cousin Louis XIV, where Charles's mother, Henrietta Maria, was in residence as a poor relation of the Bourbon family. Charles had endured a miserable time there. His mother wanted him to pay court to his ghastly cousin, La Grande Mademoiselle. He conveniently forgot all his French, and eventually he was permitted by Mamma to move off to spend Christmas with his sister. But of course, by that time, at the turn of 1648-49, they knew that the king, Charles I, their father, was on trial, however bizarre this might have seemed to them, and they feared quite rightly for his life. So it was a rather subdued time. And of course, eventually the news came through in early February that Charles I had been executed. And as Charles II, his 18-year-old son, pondered this extremely uncertain future in exile, it may just have crossed his mind that he was about to become a father himself. His first mistress was a young Welsh adventuress called Lucy Walter. There may have been some other women in his past in the Channel Islands. We can't really say for sure. But Lucy Walter and he had had what I think would be probably accurately described as a sort of midsummer fling. They were both 18, both dark, as you can see from this picture. Charles was good looking, so was Lucy. As a result of what may have been an affair for no more than a few days, she became pregnant with the king's first illegitimate child, the first of 14. And thereafter, they pretty much separated. She tried to remain a part of Charles's life unsuccessfully. He went back to France for a while. He travelled through Germany. The years he spent in exile were perhaps the formative years of his life, and they were very unhappy ones. He was penniless. He had a lot of hangers-on. He had no real thought of what his future might be until the English Republic fell apart at the beginning of 1660. And by that time, Lucy Walter was dead, and she had been well out of his life for some years before that. But his eldest son was known as James Scott and had been sent to Paris to be brought up there by a minor English nobleman. Charles had perhaps not treated him as well as he might have as a child, partly because he had very little money to support him. In Paris, Charles had had a few other mistresses, and also while he was in what is now Belgium, and he'd had at least 2 or 3 more illegitimate children. So that by the time he returned to London in 1660 as the restored Stuart monarch, he was already quite well known for his predilection for the ladies and the fact that he had a growing family. And he would soon turn his attentions to a woman who would be a crucial part of his life for almost the next decade. And here she is, Barbara Palmer, née Villiers, Countess of Castlemaine, and here painted as the Madonna by Sir Peter Lilly, the great Stuart court painter. She's posing here with her son by Charles, well, her eldest son. They had a number of children together, 3 boys and a couple of girls. Barbara was a woman of great beauty. She was enormously greedy, quite sexually voracious. Charles II was by no means her only lover. And as you can probably tell from looking at this portrait, she had, in common with other of Charles's mistresses, a real flair for publicity, or for knowing what within the sort of terminology of our own times would be, of celebrity, and how to present herself on the wider public stage. And she was a considerable patron of the arts. Sir Peter Lilly absolutely adored her. He loved painting her. She was this passionate woman with beautiful chestnut auburn hair, a very strong personality, extremely fertile. Unlike many other women at the time, she seems to have produced child after child with no real problem whatsoever. She was back at court within a matter of weeks. And this is at a time when many women died in childbirth and their children often died with them or later on, but her brood survived. She was very unpopular. She wanted a lot of money for her upkeep. She was a notoriously difficult woman. She and Charles had numerous rows and fights, but for much of the 1660s, she dominated his personal life, and therefore, to a degree, his court, despite his marriage in 1662, which I will talk about a bit later on. I will speak about his wife. But I thought that people would like this rather splendid portrait. I mean, in some ways, it verges on being almost obscene and sacrilegious, I think. But there she is. She was married to the unfortunate Roger Palmer, her rather good-looking husband, actually, who soon realised what a terrible mistake he'd made in marrying this lady. She had been the mistress of the Earl of Chesterfield before Charles II, and she came into Charles's life sometime in 1660. We don't precisely know how or where, and she would remain, as I said, a dominant figure for much of the next decade. Eventually, as other ladies came along, and as Barbara's tantrums and demands became more and more trying, Charles decided that it was time perhaps to put the relationship on a more distant, if still friendly footing. And she was still appearing at court even in the months before he died. But during the time of Barbara's tenure as sort of unofficial maîtresse en titre, Charles had fallen extremely heavily for this young lady, Frances Teresa Stuart, who's not very well known and who's generally been written off as a silly, giggly, flippity-gibbet. And one of the things I found in looking through her papers, many of which are in the West Sussex Record Office, and just considering who she was and what she did eventually in the end, is that there is far more to this girl than meets the eye. She was a very pretty girl, as you can see from this picture. She was also painted by Lilly. He painted nearly all of the king's mistresses or the prominent ladies of the court. But Frances Teresa Stuart, as you can probably tell from the name, was a very, very distant relative of the main ruling Stuart branch. Her father was a royalist who had gone with his wife to Paris in exile to join many others. And although the son of she had a half brother because her mother had been married before, and the son of that marriage was staunchly Protestant, being brought up in Louis XIV's court and with her mother Sophia as one of Henrietta Maria's ladies in waiting, Frances and her sister were all obviously brought up as Catholics. She came to England in the early 1660s, recommended by Charles's beloved sister and his favourite sibling, Princess Henrietta, who was by then Duchess of Orleans. And she came recommended as the prettiest girl in the world. This may not have been an entirely responsible way to describe her, since Minette, as Charles called his sister, must have known his predilections. And Charles became obsessed by this 15-year-old. She was viewed by most other people in the court as an empty-headed giggler who liked building houses from stacks of cards and laughed hysterically at the Duke of Buckingham's brilliant mimicry of other courtiers, but was generally viewed as not having a brain in that pretty head at all. Well, eventually, by the year 1667, Frances had realised that she couldn't resist the king very much longer. Although we can't be certain, it seems probable that she never actually went to bed with him. She managed to resist him all that time, but clearly he wasn't going to be put off forever. So the empty-headed giggler sought around for some way out of this situation. And her solution to the problem was to elope with the Duke of Richmond, who had himself lost his second wife. She died just a few months earlier. The Duke of Richmond was a first cousin of Charles II, and they didn't get on very well. There was no love lost between these two close relatives. Richmond was also Duke of Lennox in Scotland. He had the two titles. He was a good-looking young man, but he was an inveterate gambler and he drank too much. Nevertheless, he did offer Frances not just a title, but also some security. Charles II was absolutely furious by this marriage. They eloped to Cobham Hall in Kent, which Richmond owned, and were married secretly there, probably towards the end of March 1667. And then attempted to sort of try and reinstate themselves at court, but were definitely pushed back in no uncertain terms by Charles II. And eventually the Duke of Richmond himself was sent as ambassador to Denmark. He and Frances seem to have had a very happy marriage. There were no children, although there were rumours that she was pregnant. But if she was, she either miscarried or there was a stillbirth. They had no surviving children, certainly. She became quite an astute businesswoman, managing her husband's extensive estates in both Scotland and England while he was away. But in an outcome that was both comical though extremely sad, in the freezing cold of the winter in Denmark in 1672, Richmond, who found the embassy there in Denmark very boring indeed, went out to take dinner on a British ship in the Sound of Elsinore. Drank so much that coming back he missed his footing going from the main vessel back to his boat that was going to carry him back to land, fell into the freezing waters, and subsequently expired on his way home, probably of hypothermia, overindulgence, and just the strain on his heart, presumably, leaving Frances a widow. She then spent several years fighting to retain what he had left her, trying to pay off his debts, which were considerable. She also contracted smallpox, which was the means, interestingly enough, of her being restored back to court. And Charles II was so upset to hear that she had contracted this serious illness that he forgot what he thought was her very poor treatment of him in the past. And so Frances returned as one of Queen Catherine of Braganza's ladies. The smallpox did not greatly disfigure her. Apparently it left her with a slightly droopy eye. But it was a series of these bizarre events which restored her to royal favour. But I think we can safely say that she was the one that got away. Now, let's move on to a lady who had by that time arrived in England in 1670 and who's always known as Charles's French mistress. This is the Breton, Louise de Keroualle, who came from a rather junior and insignificant family in the Breton nobility. We don't know very much about her childhood. She was probably convent educated. But the thing to remember about Louise is that she had been one of the ladies in waiting to Charles's sister, Henrietta. When Henrietta died, very suddenly, though she'd been in ill health for quite a lot of her young life, she was only 26 years old. When she died, Charles promised that he would look after some of her ladies in waiting and bring them to England. Louise was not the only one, there were others, but she was perhaps, interestingly enough, the most good looking. Now that may not be quite so obvious from this particular portrait because this was taken when she was somewhat older. And as you can see, she looks more mature, but when we get to the end of the presentation, you'll see, I think, why Charles fell so deeply in love with her. She spoke little English. She was a virgin when she came to England, and Charles pursued her and did eventually seduce her, which he had not managed to do with Frances Teresa Stuart. And she became, if you like, the replacement, I suppose, for Barbara Palmer. Her greatest rival at the time was probably Nell Gwynn, who, with her typical wit and acerbic nature, referred to Louise as Squintabella. But Louise was given various titles. Eventually, she ended up as Duchess of Portsmouth. The English people hated her because Charles spent so much money on her, and she was French and a Catholic. They couldn't or wouldn't pronounce her name and referred to her as Mrs. Carwell rather than Keroualle. And she became deeply unpopular, but she became, if you like, a hostess for Charles. She had great taste. He gave her this magnificent suite of rooms in Whitehall Palace. There she would entertain leading politicians who all vied to attend these kind of soirees. Louise would like, I think, to have had people believe, as indeed they did at the time, that she had great political influence on Charles. The reality was probably somewhat less so, but she did dabble in politics. She got involved in the exclusion crisis between 1679 and 82, when concerted efforts were made to bar James, Duke of York, Charles's younger brother, from the succession. And she had one son by Charles, who became eventually Duke of Portsmouth, Duke of Richmond, in fact, because he inherited the title of Frances Teresa Stuart's dead husband. And so Louise was the great lady of the last 15 years or so of Charles's reign. She patronised French musicians, French artists. She was always present at Charles's side at these social gatherings. She helped relax him. He seems to have been genuinely quite fond of her. He called her Fubs, which is an old English name for someone who's become tubby. And as you can probably see from this picture, as she grew older, she probably did become a bit tubby. She was the key mistress of the major part of Charles's reign, I suppose. It's been said that she was a spy for Louis XIV. That's a bit of an exaggeration, I think. Obviously, the French were very happy to glean from her any tidbits that they could, and we don't really know quite how much she was able to pass on. I think she was more interested in her position at the English court rather than being a purveyor of information to Louis XIV. But she was a very important person, and even if she didn't have a great deal of practical influence over Charles, politicians perceived her as having that. And of course, at the time, to contemporaries, that was of equal importance. So there she is, again looking rather mature and regal, I think, in that picture. Now, the last of Charles's mistresses, who didn't come to England until well into the 1670s, was this, I think, divine-looking lady. She has the most wonderful face and the most extraordinary and interesting life. This is Hortense Mancini, Duchess Mazarin, who was the niece of the French First Minister, Cardinal Mazarin. She was born in Rome to, again, minor Italian aristocracy. She was one of 5 very beautiful sisters, and her uncle viewed these girls and his nephew as his inheritors. They were the people who would carry his name forward and help his family survive. She arrived as a 7 or 8-year-old who didn't speak any French and was soon schooled in the language and trained up by her elder sister, who had married a French nobleman. She arrived with her sisters at court, where Mazarin was very keen that they should be accepted and acknowledged. He wanted to make splendid marriages for them. He married Hortense off to a French nobleman, Charles de la Meilleraye, who was a Viscount, Antoine Charles de la Meilleraye, who was an extremely strange man. He was actually quite a good-looking man, but he had all sorts of amazing phobias. He kept poor Hortense absolutely under his thumb. They managed to have several children together, but he forced her to travel with him when she was heavily pregnant. He wouldn't let her see anyone. He wouldn't even let her have the jewels that were rightfully hers. And his obsession with prudery became more and more serious, to the point that his astonished and frightened household were given orders to smash the genitals of all of the priceless statuary that Cardinal Mazarin had collected. And the Duke of Mazarin, as he became when he married Hortense, even thought that when he was in his rural seats that it was extremely bad form for milkmaids to actually milk cows because it might give them sexual longings. So as you can tell, it wasn't much fun being married to this man, and eventually Hortense decamped. She ran away and travelled in Europe. She was living in Savoy for a while and other places, until eventually, rather desperate for somewhere to settle, she was invited to the English court and arrived one Christmas time after a very stormy crossing. She was made of very stern stuff. She was very briefly probably Charles's mistress, and their affair was one of the more discreet that he handled. I mean, he had asked as a young man in exile to marry her, and Mazarin had rather coldly and viciously turned him down. So it was a bit of a turning of the tables, I suppose. But Hortense settled in England. She became the muse of a French philosopher who lived here at the same time. She ended up drinking far too much, and her fairly early death in the late 1690s was rather sad, but you can still see her very sizable bill for gin at Boughton House in Northamptonshire, where she was eventually, well, she didn't settle there, but the incumbent helped sort out her affairs. So I think she's a lovely and fascinating woman with a tremendously dramatic life. She actually wrote her own memoir called The Wandering Life I Led, and that is before she came to England. She came over to England to actually live here. So there she is, I think, looking very attractive, and you can understand why Charles was attracted to her. And someone he sadly wasn't nearly so attracted to, and I thought I would say a bit about her towards the end of the talk, is his unfortunate wife, the Portuguese Princess Catherine of Braganza, who was probably the only woman who ever actually truly loved Charles. She fell madly in love with her handsome husband when she came here. She had led quite a sheltered life in Portugal. She was the daughter of the first king of the restored Portuguese monarchy, the House of Braganza. For those of you who don't know, I'll just say briefly that for much of the Middle Ages and certainly into the 16th century, Portugal struggled to maintain its independence on the Iberian Peninsula from Spain. And eventually, in the mid-17th century, the nobles revolted yet again, and they put John of Braganza, Catherine's father, on the throne. He was a relative of earlier kings of Portugal. And Catherine came with an enormous dowry, I think the largest that any English monarch ever received. She also brought access to Portugal's Brazilian Empire, to Tangier and Bombay, which were important trading posts. And she's often written off as this sad little woman who spent most of her life either in tears or hearing mass. But there's more to Catherine than that. When it was realised she couldn't have children, and she had several unsuccessful pregnancies, she forged a separate life of her own, apart from the king. She ostentatiously sponsored Italian and Dutch artists and musicians, in contrast to Louise de Keroualle. She introduced the English to drinking tea as a pleasant pastime, as opposed to some rather nasty medicinal brew. She had great taste in what we would call home furnishings now, I suppose. She introduced a lot of wicker work and things like that into England. And she was much loved by her household. It's true that she always took a back seat because probably there wasn't really any other role open to her. But I'd like to challenge the view that Catherine was a weeping nonentity, because she wasn't. And her position as an English Queen Consort, I think, is often overlooked and underrated. So there she is. She, of course, had herself painted. She's splendidly attired, as you can see, wearing the almost trademark pearl necklace that every lady who was painted at the time seems to have worn. But she's not the sad little figure that people often think that she might be. She lived on after Charles's death. She was the only woman allowed to see him when he lay dying in Whitehall Palace in February 1685. The Mistresses, certainly Louise, was kept well away. It was quite against royal protocol for anyone like that to be involved. And she was completely overcome by Charles's suffering, because the poor man really did have a horrible death. He was subjected to all the quackery of the time, which was quite gruesome. And he did acknowledge the role that Catherine had played by saying that he had not treated her well, at least if his last words are to be believed. And of course, on his deathbed, he converted to Catholicism. Catherine had survived attempts to implicate her in supposed Catholic plots and quite a lot of criticism at the time. And I think the one thing that can be said for well, there are many things that can be said for Charles, which I'll sum up in just a minute. This is the cover of my book, which shows Louise de Keroualle looking considerably more luscious, perhaps, than in the portrait I showed you earlier on. You can understand from that, I think, why Charles was so enamoured of her. But if we consider the king himself, why did he behave this way? He had 13 or 14, it depends whether you count one of Barbara Palmer's children as his, and most likely it wasn't. It probably was the child of John Churchill, later well known as the Duke of Marlborough. But he had all these illegitimate children. He flaunted his mistresses. He spent money like water on them. Why did he behave this way? And I suppose the answer is because he could. And I think he was marked by 13 years of very difficult exile, which changed him from being a carefree young man to a cynic who was determined to stay on the throne. Not many people, in thinking of him as the Merry Monarch, will realise that in the secret Treaty of Dover of 1670, he effectively sold his realms to Louis XIV in return for a grant of money. It's true he didn't do what he had promised to do, which was to supply endless troops to Louis XIV and return the country to Catholicism. He did neither of those things. But his method of government was really to try and stay aloof, to pit his ministers one against the other. But he is different, I think, from Henry VIII, who of course is also sometimes viewed as a womanizer, though he went for wives rather than mistresses. And I think you've got to believe and agree, if you see all these pictures, that Charles's mistresses were a damn sight better looking than any of the 6 wives, actually. But Charles, unlike Henry VIII, did not divorce Catherine of Aragon, and Catherine of Braganza, sorry. Neither did he behead her. And he didn't actually kill off any of his ministers, though he did put some of them in the Tower of London for a while, or at least allowed them to stay there while fights were going on over what would happen to the future of his monarchy. He was also absolutely committed to legitimate descent, despite being very fond of his eldest son, the Duke of Monmouth, and indeed of his other children as well. He was an indulgent father. He seems to have viewed having all these children as a sign of his virility, but of course in the end, if none of them could inherit, it was never going to be a viable option, and I don't think it ever was in Charles's mind. And to me, he is a man who was an enigma, perhaps even to himself at the end of the day. He loved sailing, and I think that perhaps tells you a lot about him, that he was never really as happy as when he was riding with the wind in his sails away from other people and master of his own destiny. And I think at that point, Anthony, I'll stop and let you come back in if you have anything you would like to add.
Thank you, Anthony.
Thank you very much indeed, Linda, up for that. First question, and it was a very wide-ranging talk. What might the father have thought of Charles II and his behaviour? That's
a very good question. I think he would have been deeply disappointed. Charles I and Henrietta Maria had one of the happiest marriages in our history. I suppose one of the others that you might compare it with in that respect is Henry VII and Elizabeth of York. And the marriage of Charles and Henrietta Maria, after a very rocky start, it has to be said, was probably transformed by the assassination of the Duke of Buckingham, which finally meant that Charles had to turn to his wife for emotional support. And theirs was a very happy marriage and a very close liaison, despite their religious differences. So I think Charles I would have been, how shall I put it? I think he would have been infinitely saddened. I don't think he was a man who would necessarily have stood in judgment on his son for his behaviour, but I think it would have distressed him.
And the aspects that would have disappointed him would have been his frivolity?
Yes, and his infidelity, I think, as well, and his... I have a feeling that Charles I might have viewed it as not being consonant with responsible kingship to behave that way. I mean, Charles I, as you know, had a very personal, in every sense, view of what a king should be and how he should conduct himself. And I don't think the behaviour of his son would have found any kind of approval in that.
And Oliver Cromwell, we were going to have a talk tomorrow night by Paul Lay, editor of History Today. Oh. He has a family concern, so we're going to have the talk in a week or two's time. You have Oliver Tatelli, the historian of slavery, talking instead. But what do we know about Charles II's relationship with Oliver Cromwell and also his role pursuing the regicides?
Well, Charles II never met Oliver Cromwell. Charles I did, of course. They met in 1647.
What view did he have of what of this man who was responsible for the death of his father and for imposing himself in the monarch's place? How much do you know?
Yeah, I'm not sure that I can't recall reading anything which suggests what Charles II might have said directly, either in public or in private, about Oliver Cromwell. I mean, you can, I suppose, deduce from what was done to the dead bodies of Cromwell and Ireton and some of the other regicides who died before the Restoration, a degree of contempt and hatred. And Charles's pursuit of the regicides, for a man who was otherwise, as you can tell, not inclined so much to actually just slaying his opponents, though he did pursue the regicides with as much venom as he possibly could. A number of them were, of course, executed. Those who weren't, and some of them managed to get away to the American colonies, where, along with some of the other Republican Commonwealth men, they kept alive the Republican tradition after it had well and truly died out here in Britain. I have always assumed that Charles II, if asked, would have expressed rather robustly a detestation of Oliver Cromwell. But of course, during much of the period of the English Republic, his behaviour and the sort of negative reputational aspects of it played into the hands of Cromwell and Cromwell's Council of State, because they were able to portray him as this immoral, unreliable, completely sort of beyond the pale young man who is just drifting his way through Europe, picking up women and illegitimate children as he went. And so this played into the hands of Charles's enemies.
Which monarchs, Linda, would you compare Charles to? You referred obviously to Henry VIII, but coming forward to William, George IV, to Edward VII, or even to Prime Ministers Boris Johnson. Is he an early day Boris, do you think? What's the differences between Charles II and Boris?
Oh, I think Charles II was cleverer than Boris. He managed during his reign to use a considerable amount of native intelligence, I think, because whatever you may say about Charles, he was obviously an intelligent man. He managed to stay on the throne and to pass it intact to his brother, who managed to lose it within 3 years. That, I think, says something for his, not just his guile, but his commitment to monarchy. I think, I mean, God knows what Boris would have done in such a situation. I would have to say that if you asked me to put money on the one who would survive a political crisis, I would put quite a lot on Charles II, who may not be at heart as lovable as history has portrayed him, but was a capable man, given the difficulties that he faced. Of course, he did rule a divided kingdom, perhaps in the way that Boris does now. There was a great deal of religious unrest, which is often not very well known, but it wasn't a great time to be a Catholic or a Protestant nonconformist. And Charles was not nearly as popular as people think he was. He has this sort of hail fellow well met image, which is a bit like Boris's as well, I suppose. But he actually made sure he never got too close to any of his subjects. In fact, you know, when he and Catherine of Braganza arrived back to start their honeymoon at Hampton Court, the public were kept very, very well away from them. And Charles liked ceremony and he liked magnificence, but he wasn't going to be like his Stuart forebears, like the Stuarts in Scotland, like James IV of Scotland, for example, and go out and actually be seen and touched by people. That wasn't part of his view of kingship. But I think as a man dealing in very troubled waters, you have to hand it to him for what he achieved. And of course, at the end of his reign, he was ruling without parliament, which is he let them fight each other to a standstill, essentially, during the exclusion crisis. His reign did see the beginning of what we would now call the two-party system, and that grew afterwards, certainly during Queen Anne's reign. But he had pretensions, I think, to try and be a Louis XIV, but given the system in England, he was never going to be able to manage that. He was always, as Rochester said, chronically poor, a merry monarch scandalous.
He didn't have a Colbert, did he, who was...
No, he didn't. No, that's true. He had some very capable ministers, but he didn't give them his full support. And I suppose that made life difficult. I mean, nobody nowadays really knows about the Earl of Arlington and the Earl of Danby, but these were not insubstantial men, and they tried to get the country going in a certain direction. But of course, when you've got as much faction as you did under Charles II, it's not a good basis on which to try and build a solid political agenda, if you like.
You've written a great deal, Linda, about the Tudors and Stuarts, and particularly the royal women. Do we know much more about the Stuarts? Is there a much richer archive left? Yes. And tell us about that, but also about the differences between the Stuart monarchs and the Tudors. Was there an identity that all Tudors and Stuarts shared, or were they did that not, was that not a significant factor?
I think in terms...
So the documents first, and then...
The documents first, yeah. Yes, okay. Well, the answer is, of course, that there's a huge amount more available on the Stuarts. Many more letters, diaries, memoirs, diplomatic accounts, things of that sort survive. In fact, there's almost an embarrassment of riches, I suppose. Of course, a lot of this stuff has to be read with the necessity to bear in mind that most people, if you take the Earl of Clarendon, for example, and his huge history of the Great Rebellion, and then his own autobiography, these people all wrote from a specific point of view, but then perhaps that hasn't changed so much over the ages, really. So yes, there is far more documentation. I think the difference between the Tudor and the Stuart period is much more fundamental than what we learn from the greater availability of Stuart sources, however. And to me, and I think it's a point that historians should stress more, the Tudors are early modern people. They don't really even start to think like us. One of the problems I always found about writing and talking about the Tudors, and I'm afraid that it's probably intensified by the concentration on some of the females and 6 wives of Henry VIII, of which I am as guilty as the next person, I would have to say. But one of the things that bothers me is that I think there is a tendency to see the Tudors as just like us, but in fancy dress. And they were not just like us. They weren't remotely like us. Their entire world was framed differently. By the time you get to the Stuarts, you are moving on somewhat more to people whom we can recognise. We don't have their obsession with religion and the whole role of providence, which I'm sure Paul Lay will talk about because it's in the subtitle of his book. But you are starting to see ideas and sort of belief systems and the way people act that is getting closer to modern times. To me, in many respects, the Tudors are quite alien. But the one thing I think they do have in common with Stuarts is, this is going to sound slightly trite, I'm trying to think how to express it, an absolute commitment to the ideas of monarchy and kingship and what it meant to be a monarch. Perhaps that's starting to change a little bit by the time you get to the very end of the 17th century and into the reign of Queen Anne, because the relationship between a monarch and the ministers is starting to change by then.
Of course.
But I think those are the sort of differences that I see, Anthony.
Now, there are a lot of questions, that's a surprise, about sex coming up. But I just want to ask a question from Hongbo, who is one of our academics in our computing school. And his question is, he's always wanted to know why there wasn't a restoration of the, why there was a restoration of the monarchy in 1660 in this country, unlike in France. Was that inevitable? Could Britain have become a republic?
Yes, I think it could. I'm not sure how many other people would agree with that view. Perhaps the Republic was running into difficulties, but they might have been avoided. I think the crucial thing is the death of Oliver, because
in
1658.
58, wasn't it?
And of course, it's 2 years then until the restoration, or sort of a year and 9 months at any rate. And what happens, I think, is that Oliver had turned the Republic. Some people would say it was a monarchy in all but name. I've always thought of Oliver Cromwell as having more of a commitment to republicanism, even if it meant having a strong figurehead and a strong leader than people perhaps suppose. But given the way he had set up the protectorate, and indeed the way his chief advisors had, some of them responded to it, the problem lay in what would happen after his death. And Richard Cromwell, his son, who's an amiable and I think much neglected figure, a very sad figure, wandering throughout Europe and in exile, and then living quietly for many years in England, and probably in fear of his life. He just wasn't suited to take over from his father, whereas there is, I think, a distinct possibility that Henry Cromwell, who was governing in Ireland at the time, might have been able to. But you know, Oliver took the view, as did most people in that time, that you pass things down through the order of your son's birth. And Richard had not been adequately prepared to take on his father's role. And he wasn't equal to it.
So there we are. I'm going to just move on there, just simply because of time. Hongbo, the contingency. So it could have happened. The next question is about sexual diseases, and was there a risk that Charles could have caught from the mistresses sexual diseases? Did he? What would he have done? How far advanced, the question is, was medical knowledge about that?
Well, the truth seems to be rather the other way around, in that poor Louise de Keroualle caught a sexual disease from him. And it made her very ill for a while. I mean, I don't think we know exactly what sort of sexual disease it was. Charles knew that he had these problems, and because he liked to tinker with science, you know, he was genuinely interested in scientific things, I think, he dosed himself up on mercury, which had probably weakened his system and may explain why he went under so quickly in 1685. But Louise was made very ill initially. She did survive, and of course went on to outlive him by 50 years. So she was one tough French lady. But there was knowledge of the pox in its various forms. And the standard treatment was mercury, which was a particularly vicious way of dealing with it. It did work, I think, up to a point, but it had quite horrendous side effects on your system overall.
Thank you, Mary, for that question. Diana's asking about the public awareness, we're just drawing to an end now, of his sexual behaviour. and she's wondering whether there was more general acceptance then, to the extent that the public knew about what was happening, than there would be now.
I'm not absolutely sure. I mean, if you're sort of down to the level of the man in the street in 17th century England, there was a great deal of printed material poking fun at the king, at his whores, at the way that he conducted himself. And I'm not sure that it was accepted necessarily by the majority of people. There seems to have been, at least amongst the sort of non-conformists at the time, perhaps predictably, a great deal of disapproval. I think it's only in more recent times when, you know, this continuing myth of Charles as a jolly good fellow, much beloved by his subjects for reasons that no historian really understands, have gained ground. I have a feeling that it was well known that some people might have viewed it with indulgence, but that probably more people than that disapproved.
We're going to leave it there. What an extraordinarily complex and interesting man Charles II was, and there in Whitehall Palace, which again only survived 3 or so years after his death in the fire. Just an extraordinary pivotal time in British history. Thank you, Linda, very, very much for bringing that to life with such style and insight. It was a great pleasure to listen to you tonight. Thank you very, very much for being our guest.
Thank you. It was a great pleasure to be on board, Anthony. Thank you.
And do buy the book, which was extraordinarily well reviewed. Linda, thank you very, very much indeed.
Thank you, Anthony.